So, Boozoo, Mko Mose Indizhnikaz, Meshekenh dodem, eshkan ziibi Anishinaabe and inini inini Nui Shaganashi, I'll speak English. Thanks for this opportunity, Veronica. And it's great to see that there's interest in doing land-based work in the community, especially amongst some of the youth. I think that if I could go back to my youth, I would listen a bit more to my grandma, my Anishinaabe grandma, and just kind of learn why she planted things where she did and why she planted what she did, because I think I would be further ahead. But I think for the last, I would say 8 years to 9 years now, I really have dedicated myself to plants and the forest and medicines. It's a slow, steady pace. I think, I learned a little bit from Jan Longboat, and she said something to me many years back, but she said, learn just 3 plants every year. Don't try to do more than that. And if you can learn their whole cycle, so from seed to the shoot, the roots, the leaves, and the flower, and potentially, depending on what it is, the fruit, then you get to know that plant. You get to understand what it likes, what it likes to be beside, for example, what kind of soil it likes, and then 3 after that. So I've been trying to follow that advice that I got many years back, and I think by this point, in the most recent project that I had, I had, I think, 26 different species of plants in there. So I think I have to owe my interest to this knowledge, especially to another Haudenosaunee woman, and that is Janice Brandt. And she's a seed keeper for the Haudenosaunee Nation. And I don't know if it was her just excitement around plants, or just that I met her, I think it would have been about also around 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago now. I met her in Fonda, New York, and I had traveled down to Tom Porter's land to do a writing retreat. And at the time I was working on some academic stuff, and there was mostly actually a group of other women there, and they were all really, really special women, many of whom I still connect with. And I remembered that one day Janice came over, and she was really quiet. She's a really quiet, kind of shy person. I'm like, anybody who knows me, I'm pretty outgoing and a little bit crazy sometimes. And so I was just kind of writing, and she came and sat with me, and she started to talk about her story. And I'll never forget that moment, because there's certain moments in life that change you. And I don't think it was so much about her and I, talking or chatting. I think it was the spirit of the seeds that she takes care of. And I guess by that point, she'd probably been doing her work with seeds for 20 years or more. I don't know exactly how long. I know she's been doing it since she's a kid, and she's getting older now, but very young energy, very just very kind, very, very kind woman. And there's something about us, like the interaction that we just got along very well. And I think, you know, we can all relate to just the laughter that our people engage when we meet somebody who we can trust. And so I still talk to her. In fact, she just sent me an email a couple of days ago, and she has taken on a seed collection that the Sisters of Providence maintained about 400 different seeds. And it's surprising that she's taken on, you know, part of this collection in her community. It's just so admirable, and like it makes me feel like a bit emotional, because I know that the responsibility she already has with, you know, I would sit in her kitchen in the fall and we'd be shucking you know, 9 different types of beans, maybe more. And I remember all the different colors and the different types. You know, the beans were very consistent in their size and shape, but the colors were just so beautiful, and she'd have names for them all, and they're, you know, ancient strains. And so I think at the time when I first began that journey, I didn't really appreciate what that takes, you know, what it takes to uphold that ancestral knowledge through the engagement with the seeds. And I think that, you know, that singular moment, the whole time, I mean, being on that land in upper New York, you know, being around Tom Porter, of course, traveling, and we did some ceremony, and Tom also had he had some, I think, big Angus cows, and I remember going out there feeding them with apples. And actually he has a daughter, I can't remember her name in the moment, and she's really special. She's just a special woman, and she took me out on the four-wheeler, and I didn't know what to expect, but we had collected you know, several buckets full of apples. We put them on the quad, and you know, I mean, I still am, I guess, but at the time, you know, I was really a city boy. So I'm getting out there and thinking, where's this girl taking me, you know? And we go out into the fields, and she goes, you know, throw the apples. And so we threw the apples, and there was literally a stampede, and these cows were enormous. You know, they must have been 2,000-3,000 pounds, and they were black, and then all of a sudden they're running. Like, they're not just like coming over, like, you know, I've never seen a cow run before and not is coming straight at me, and I'm like, what do we do? You know, like I'm like, what do we do? You know, because I was scared. And she's just like, just stay behind the apples. And then they all came, and then it was just amazing, because they just start feasting on these apples, and you know that they had done it before, and it was a big treat. So that weekend was really, I think, the moment where my energy shifted, and I thought, you know, I want to do that work. I want to be responsible for seeds. I want to be responsible for feeding people and providing that kind of awareness. And I have some presentation stuff here. I'm going to share my screen for a little bit, because I think there's some important things that I want to show to you guys. So can everybody see my screen here?
Yep.
Okay. So there's, you know, like, my work has really, I think, evolved from that. So I've gone a little bit, I think, beyond the seed saving. You know, there's a place in our civilization for everyone. And I think I'm starting to understand my place more and more. And a lot of the teachings that I've received from elders like Peter and others have all mostly been about, like, the philosophy and the worldview, and how it is we kind of really remember. And that's what, you know, the space that I worked on. And I don't call it a garden, because I think gardening is really, you know, it's a colonial thing. And what we did, or what we did before, and it's not just Anishinaabe people, it's Haudenosaunee people and Huron people. It was really about restoring land and ensuring that future generations can thrive from that land. And so we had a responsibility, and part of that responsibility was connecting our heart and our mind. You know, our intention, which is Nandamawan, like it's this, you know, all our language is about action. It's not about labeling things. It's about what we do and how we do it. And so Nandamawan is more than just an intention. It's a specific kind of intention. And it's an intention I really think that was about allowing, you know, future generations to thrive and to be able to use the land in a way that didn't just take care of your family or your friends, but really took care of your whole community, your whole nation, and not just the nation of the humans, but as Peter has said to me many times, we have to remember all the other ones first. You know, we're the last really to come to the earth. And if we take care of our relatives, you know, they're going to take care of us. And so that includes the seeds, it includes the soil, like all the minerals that are in there. So let me get into a few things here. So, you know, this is the land, this area specifically where, you know, Southwestern Ontario is where a lot of my learning has evolved. And, you know, prior to colonization, there was a forest here, but it wasn't just, you know, a forest. Like, it's kind of hard to wrap the mind around the extent of the knowledge that was here because it's so extraordinary. And the more that I learn, the more it just opens up these new pathways of awareness for me that make me appreciate our peoples. And so I think it's Doug Williams who talks about the peoples who are here, and he says that the Mississaugas or the Mishisagig, the people that we lived at the mouths of those rivers all along the northern shores of Erie and Ontario, what we call Erie and Ontario today, and right around this area here and up into the peninsula, where we have like Tobermory. Those peoples, our ancestors, they were really focused, I think, on fishing primarily. Like they, and not just fishing, you know, they would have ate within the forests, but you know, they were primarily living on the shores, the mouths of the rivers. And we have to acknowledge in what seasons that was, because it wasn't just living at the mouths of the rivers. Like during the ice times, they would have likely moved inland, had winter camps where they could, you know, be protected from some of those elements. But Doug says that around 1200 years ago, these people arrived and they spoke a different language, and he refers them to the Ayadawat. And they were different from the Six Nations. Now, I've traveled way down into the, what do you call them, the Carolinas. And the Carolinas, like North Carolina, where I traveled to, is known as the seedbed for all of the Americas. You find there every major tree today that you find in the Carolinian forest, and I'm going to talk about like what was in that forest a little bit, you find down in the Carolinas. And these people that arrived, I don't think they arrived fleeing from maybe some enemy. I think that the climate had slowly heated over the course of many generations. And they realized that this area here that was primarily occupied and lived in by the Anishinaabe peoples, or the Algic speaking peoples, it was viable for transformation. And so what led this transformation, of course, is the arrival of corn. But it's not just the arrival of corn into this region. And if you want to consider the arrival of corn, you have to consider it's not just corn that arrives, it's a people who took responsibility for that corn. And they were Iroquois speaking. And I kind of think that those peoples were probably a branch of the Cherokee. The Cherokee are Iroquois speaking as well. And likely there was agreements amongst many different peoples who spoke dialects of Iroquois for those peoples to arrive and to make an agreement with the Anishinaabe or with the Meshekenh at that time. And they probably either came up through this area here or up through this area here. And I think that the agreement with the Meshekenh or the Mississaugas was of mutual benefit. And why I'm convinced of that, and why I don't think it was like under duress or anything like that, is partially through the history of the wampum. And so you see these agreements being made and etched in these, fine beads, wrapped in these belts that, of course, diplomats would have carried. We must have had at that time a sophisticated diplomacy. And it's really interesting to see kind of what happens next. Doug, he talks about our peoples beginning to learn each other's languages. And I don't think that was out of necessity. I think it was out of a deep love for each other's cultures, and recognizing that if those what some texts refer to as Chinatan peoples, if those peoples or Chalatan, who are really unique in the sense that they actually tend deer. So they engage in a type of animal husbandry long ago and upkept that. And there's stories about how they would bring deer into their, I guess, palisades, what you call, and probably some of you are familiar with a palisade. And what you'll see is an earthen mound with huge stakes. And it was like a labyrinth. Like it wasn't just a gate like you see in kind of today, or open the gates. Like it was a labyrinth, and if you didn't know how to get into that through that labyrinth, then you would hit a dead end, and likely you might be either an enemy or a foreign person who wasn't welcomed. So there was a lot of interaction that happened. And what we see is that this area, in fact, it's a huge area down here as well, but I want to focus on Southwestern Ontario because that's where, your ancestors are from. But what we see is a transformation, and the transformation, I'm going to just skip down to a slide. All of a sudden, what we see, this isn't the one. This is the one that I want to show you. We see the introduction of a whole plethora, a whole bunch of different types of foods entering into this region. And it was dominated primarily by the oak tree. And of course, the oak produced acorn. There's 11 types of oak in the Carolinian forest. Oaks like chinkapin oak and Bur oak, black oak, white oak, red oak, swamp white oak. And it's the white oak that's really, I think, important to this conversation because, again, my work is really about how do we restore habitat, not so we can maybe just get one harvest in our garden, but how do we restore habitat so that, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, your relatives can harvest in abundance from those spaces. And so the oak tree, the habitat changed so that it could support the life of the oak. And what's really interesting is that we know that the forest didn't just evolve because, squirrels were taking oaks or birds were taking acorns and planting them in random places. There has been studies done on the DNA of acorns. And so different stands of oak, and I'll just come back to this map here. There's different stands of oak, in here, all the way up here. In fact, oaks are growing now all up into this region. But when you look at the DNA of the oak, you see, okay, this stand of oak, it had to have been planted and it had to have been carried by humans because there's just no way that it could have traveled that far. There's even many oaks on Manitoulin Island now. And so this was a deliberate act, and that's kind of how our ancestors lived. We lived very deliberately in our actions. And that's kind of when we talk about Minobamatsuin, that way of the good life. That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about, see, when you break down that word, Minobamatsuin, there's a really important word in there, and it's min. Okay, and min connects to so many important harvests. And I'm gonna just pull up this. This is a sort of a framework for our cosmology or our world view. And of course, I'm not gonna, like, I teach a course that takes 14 weeks to sort of break all this down. But if I just start, this is a starting point here with the spring, and it's our year as Anishinaabe peoples really started with the sugar making moon, and Zinzabakwadoke Gises. And Peter, do you know the word for spring?
Zigwan.
Zigwan. And summer?
I think that's Dibwin. No, that's not it either. It's
I forget.
Nibin?
Nibin?
Nibin.
Yeah. So our year really started with this, the flowing of that sweet water in those trees. And so it wasn't about, on this date at this time, that's our new year. Our new year really began with this action of going out to those sugar maple sugars and starting to collect that sweet water. And I don't think every village or every group, and it's important to talk about the village for a second, and I'm gonna just switch through slides. But the village here, you see this word Odena. Okay, the village was the place where the people's hearts gathered, and that word Ode, and this is part of this is something that Peter also shared with me, and I think I tried to take it to a different space because I'm just started to like all these different words resonate. And if I just play this slide here, we start at the center for our peoples. So they're starting in the spring when the sweet water starts to rise in those trees, but also we start at our center place. For our peoples, for all human beings, you know, at that point of conception, your heart is the first thing to grow, and it's growing according to these like two like laws. And one is the you know, that connection to water, and the other one is the connection to the electricity, or wasmo. And it's these two things that begin to allow your heart to beat and grow. And so when I talk about Odeana, the village, that's the place where the hearts gather. And those would have been safe spaces. And this is really important for this work, because when we're doing this work of restoring land and creating spaces for people to start to grow, right? Like grow the land so it can be viable for future generations. We have to ensure that the community, like it's a safe place for the community members. And that's challenging sometimes, because, you know, everybody has their own kind of opinions on things, or sometimes their own wounds. But in the space that I had, you know, hundreds of people came and helped. And it would not have been possible had I not created a safe space, an environment where people felt welcomed. And so I think that's really important to talk about. But this word bish, or water, there's different words for water, like nebewa bo, that medicine that we hold up. But you can see, if we use this word for water, bish, that you see a connection with the fire, ishkode. And so what I've come to understand is that ish, and you could see it, Anishinaabe, right? That's what we are as peoples. And there's a bunch of other words that have ish in them, or like shishigwe, like that, shaker. They are talking about a certain kind of energy. And that energy, I think it starts like, it's like down in your core, like down in your root, and it rises up, right? And it's how a civilization is created. It's the union between that man and the woman that makes the child. But that ishkode, right? The fire is actually also referring to something happening here. And I think if we think about the mind, heart, and the connection of our will, this is the alignment that is critical for us to do some of this work on the land. So ish does translate to strength. But again, these are just English translations. And when we break down the words in Anishinaabe to English, we have to do a lot of explaining in order to really understand, well, what does it mean to have strength? Well, for our peoples, having strength really meant going out onto the land, right? And it comes back to that word min, odemin, okay? And before I get there, like there's odewagan, and that's the drum. And then there's Odena, of course, the village, the places where the people's hearts gather. But here's Odemin. Odemin was a really important harvest for our peoples, the strawberry. And it also is known to cleanse the blood. And this word min at the end of Odemin, it actually is part of almost every harvest. So you have like Jaushkomin, which is like those red berries or raspberries. And in our area, we have wild black caps, but they come up at that time. And then Jaushkomin is like the blueberry. And then you have like Macadamin, or blackberry. But you also have things like Mandamin. Okay, and Mandamin is the corn, and Minomen. Minomen is the wild rice, and Gokosamin. Gokosamin is squash, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. Some of them I've forgotten. Miniman, I think, is the apple. But all these harvest words, a whole bunch of them anyways, have min, right? And so what is min? Well, min is really that sustainer of life. That's how it's been taught to me. It's the translates to as the sustainer of life, or that thing that supports life, right? In our lives. And so when you look at Minoba Matswin, how do we break down that word? Well, how I have come to understand it is, why does it mean the way of a good life? Because the way of a good life is actually going to those places of harvest and collecting and gathering up those nutritious foods, and bringing your baskets, and then filling them so you can share with your community, right? And that's really what I think Minoba Matswin breaks down to, because Bamadis or Bamoseyan is about a movement, a walking, right? Bamoseyan's walking. But I don't think we had a word for walking, because I think there was always an intention to how we moved on the earth. And that's really, I think, if we're going to start, right, have a starting point, that's the starting point, is that this work is about how does one move upon the earth? How did our people move upon the earth? Well, just this other word that I introduced here, like Ode Boewin, is the truth. Well, what is truth? And again, you see this Boewin, and again, I think it's referring to a movement of the body on this planet. And it's a movement that's guided by the heart, and not just guided like in a theoretical sense, but guided by the beating of it. And how do you keep your heart beating strong? Well, you eat those good foods that come from the earth. You go out, you do the work of harvesting them, planting those seeds, if that's the work that you can do in your community. Going out and gathering up those acorns, learning about the names of the different trees in your area, and finding out, okay, what are their benefits? What are their medicines? And every single plant, every single tree has medicine or medicinal properties. So the other word I introduce here is Medellin, and I introduce it here because it stems from this space here, from the heart, and it literally translates to the sound of the heartbeat of another. And I think that sometimes this word can be confused today because of certain things, but when we translate it back into the old language, all it's saying is that it's the sound of the heartbeat of another. And I think that it was so important to our peoples to ensure that the sound of the heartbeat of those other people who are around us was strong, right? And so how do we do that? How do we make sure that our elders' heartbeat is strong? Well, we go and we gather those medicines and we bring them to them, and we say, eat this, Wiesenen, eat this, my relative, because I want your heartbeat to be strong. And a song came to me, actually. I'm gonna just sing a verse of it because I think it's important in this moment. After I listened to the creation story as told by Onabenese. And he shared that story in English, and sadly I don't have enough of the language to understand it all in Anishinaabe Moan. But he talked about this moment in our creation story when Anishinaabe is going out, and he has already named all the beings of the earth. He's gone around the world, earth, and this is his second time. And he finds that little tiny odamen, that little tiny strawberry. And he's not sure yet what is medicine and what is maybe poisonous, because and I think it's important also to note And this is something I learned from the elders I worked with in Belize. I went down there for many years, about 4 years, into the jungle. And they said, whatever there's a poison, there's always an antidote. But also, things that maybe our Western science identify as poisonous aren't always poisons. They can be medicines too, but it all depends on how you handle it, how you treat it, and how it's prepared. And so some things, like, for example, something that's more common, what's the thing that turns into the greenery? They're like little spirals. Peter, you probably know this one. They grow like little spirals, and you harvest them, or who else knows? I always forget the name. They're like they're green. Yes, fiddleheads. Thank you, Peter. So the fiddleheads. What's that?
Say thank Lou.
Okay, yeah. Lou's listening here. Now I'm nervous. I better be careful what I say about the Haudenosaunee. Joke. So the fiddleheads, like, you need to cook those. You can't just go and eat them because they're gonna make you sick. You have to, like, fry them up, and I recommend frying them up in like butter and butter and salt and a little pepper. But this is all the things that our people would have had to understand, and when you start to sort of break this all down, it makes the orders of complexity, the magnitude orders of complexity of the knowledge that our people had grow, right? It's just extraordinary, because there would have been people who had to know all those plants, and there's no one person, no one family who could have known them all. There's just too many. There's just too many preparations. And I've been in Manitoulin. One of my teachers up in Manitoulin, he's showing me medicines that are like 38 medicines, 38 different plants all combined to make a single medicine. And all those plants now have to be harvested at different times under different circumstances. For example, some have to be harvested under certain moon cycles, right? They have to be, and so for some of them, there's like literally a 1 week window. Sometimes there's one day when thanks, Daniel. I see you have that in the comments there too, the fiddleheads. There might just be one day when that plant blooms and is able to be harvested. So this is the extent of our knowledge, and I think much of it has been lost, or it's being kept very secret right now. And I think it's important that, like, one has to show commitment to this knowledge in order to really become responsible for it. Because in our teachings, there is no knowledge without responsibility. That's what, like, that Kendasuan means. It's the, like, any knowledge that you might gain is responsibility. And so for me, just on a personal level, like, this is what Anishinaabe is. I'm not going to go too much into this, what I have here. I'm going to go back because it's just too much. But like, for me personally, on a personal level, like, when you start to take responsibility for different seeds like I have, and different sets of knowledges, you have to also be able to take breaks and rest, and you have to have a community of support and people who are gonna stand with you in this work, because it cannot be done alone. No single person can do this. It is the responsibility of our community. And it's a big one. It's a huge one, because right now we're dealing with an environment that has been severely damaged. I mean, if I come back to this with the various plants here, each one of these plants is medicine. Each one of these plants is food. And I think another part of it is that each one of these plants like they grow in combination with other plants, and our peoples alongside those Iroquois speaking peoples, and the Huron called those peoples the Attawandaron, and so we know that they were different from the Huron because the Huron had a name for them, and we know that they were different from the Mississauga because they had a name for them, and we even know that the Iroquois, like the Six Nations who are now living, in this region, they also had a name for these peoples. They were a special people. I believe that because they were so respected that they were protected by all peoples, and it wasn't until after arrival, after disease struck those peoples down in great numbers, that things dramatically changed in Southwestern Ontario. But for 600, 700, 800 years, we traded with them, and so now what we see, and this is a really interesting point about the people who lived in this region, where you guys are living now, and where I've lived for many years, is that they were some of the healthiest bones. So archaeologists have dug up the bones, and I don't agree with that necessarily, but I've actually met one of the archaeologists who's done work and who writes about this on the bones, and they are some of the healthiest bones to ever be found on this earth because of this diet that they had. It wasn't just, anybody who will say to you, oh, and the native people were hunter-gatherers, tell them, yes, we hunted, and yes, we gathered, but we were so much more than that, because I'm not even going to get into this because it's just too much, but we actually designed the forest. And so, again, there is a lot here to unpack. There's a lot to break down to start to understand how do we actually restore again the earth in a way that honors the peoples of the past, but that also honors the people of the future, because that's who we really need to think about now. We have generations of people coming up who are in there's great trouble coming to our earth. And so we have to be able to, and no pressure to anybody, and hopefully people aren't like, oh my God, or anything. Like, I'm not afraid of what's coming, but it is coming. Great change is coming. It's already here, and with COVID, you see that, but there's greater changes coming. And I think that this knowledge about the earth, about what our ancestors did to create relationships with our neighbors, is exactly what we need now in order for us to survive, and not just survive, but thrive into the future. So I'm just going to show you just a couple pictures. Like, this is the space. I won't be working in this space any longer because I'm moving up north. It was taken away from me. But I'm going up to Sault Ste. Marie to teach now. But, I put my heart and soul into this work, and it wasn't just me. Here's some of the harvest that we had, the beans and the blue corn. This is a sacred corn. And now it's growing in different other places from people who have taken the seed that I grew, and now they're growing it. So I'm really fortunate. These seeds, this is the grand flower sunflower, and these seeds came directly from Janice Brandt. And so, I think she'd be proud of me to know that I did take the seeds. Actually, the beans as well, the strawberry bean, come directly from her gardens. And this blue corn came from Oneida. So actually all these seeds that are in this picture come directly from Haudenosaunee peoples. And I feel just really grateful. It's kind of funny because this work was really women's work. But I think the men had a responsibility too in ensuring that the habitat could be sustainable. So, it's hard work. And And I think I want to just go beyond like corn, beans, and squash, because those three sisters, yes, they have a symbiotic relationship, but as Janice said to me many times, it's the three sisters and all her cousins, right? And so like tobacco and the sunflower and hazelnuts and Jerusalem artichoke, those are all things that they're not just annuals, they're perennials. And so when we're designing space so that we can bring in the bees to pollinate, and we have to really start thinking about all these different relatives that are sort of in here. Like I grew I harvest the trout lily tubers in the early spring. This is the first sign. You'll know it's a healthy forest if you see the trout lily tubers. Also something else that's not on here, I don't think. But the trillium is also edible. Of course, we're not supposed to pick it, but if you just pick off one leaf, it will still grow, or one part of the flower. It's all edible, the trillium. And it has a little bulb at the base of it that's also edible. But be careful harvesting trilliums if you're you can't harvest them now, they're done, their season. But cleaver, sweet pea, hazelnut, I grew hazelnut, hickory nut, of course, is a big tree. But I encourage you guys to go out and actually they're already starting to fall. I found some hickories already, just little baby ones. I actually think that the squirrels pray. And you ever see them doing this? They're always going like this. I think they're sometimes praying for the seeds, and it's really beautiful right now because the acorns are already starting to fall. And I think that those squirrels, they have a symbiotic relationship with those trees, and I think they ask, hey, we're hungry now, can we get some of those acorns? And the trees go, of course, my relative, of course we can give you some. That's how I feel about that. But this was my acorn harvest last year, and I made a mistake though, because I had them in this reusable bag and I thought it would be breathable. And by the time I got to starting to shuck them and prepare them for leaching, a lot of them had already expired, like they had bugs in them and stuff. So whenever you get these harvests, you really got to lay them out, dry them out, make sure there's no bad ones, take the bugs out if there is any, and just really make sure there's a cleanliness there. Yeah, so I think that's all I'm going to talk about today. I'm getting a bit tired myself. I'm right in the midst of moving, so the last 2 days have been crazy. But if I'm happy, I'm sure Peter, if you have any questions for us, I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now. But if you guys have any questions or comments. Oh, I want to show you one other thing. Sorry. This is one other. Can you guys see this plant here?
Yep.
This is actually Datura, or moonflower, and I started this from seed this season in December, and I didn't know when they were supposed to be planted, so I started them in December, and I had them in a tray. And I've given a bunch away. This is the only one that I kept. And actually, I just left this guy today because my friend will take care of. But it finally, I think it was December, January, February, early March. Nothing happened in that tray. Nothing happened in that whole time. And I was like, oh man, like those seeds never took. And I was literally that week planning to just plant tobacco in those little pods that I had, because none of my seeds came up of my Datura or moonflower. It's called by many names, this one. But then in early March, I seen this a little thing come up, and then they all started to come up, and I've given many away. This is when you grow it just in a little pot like this, it'll grow just like kind of one flower, which you see here. But this finally flowered from December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, and then now we're almost at August. So 9 months this took, and it just flowered last night. And so that's the patience that you need for this work. That like Peter was saying, like he sees something coming out, and what's that? And probably from his compost. And these beings, these relatives of ours, they really want to take care of us. And my heart, like I feel emotional. This might be because I'm really tired, but my heart is just with the plants, like to see this come to this point where you have this flower and it's so beautiful, right? And that's what's at our hands when we do this work. That's what we have at our fingertips. So thank you guys for listening and entertaining me while I ramble on. And Peter taught me well.